Robert said to me earlier today, you're a glass half full person, and he's right about that. One of my colleagues came to me in the office a couple of weeks ago and said, look at this, it's really dreadful. And I said, what is it? And he said, do you know that less than 0.5% of the energy that drives your car is carrying the driver? And I smiled at him and he said, what are you smiling at? It's really terrible. I said, no, well, I'm a design engineer. That means I've got 99.5% to go at here. So the optimism here is that there's masses of excess in our system that we can rip out, actually, and we already have the technology. And you've seen, Stephen's shown you some, Bill Ford's talking about others. So I think this is really a time for us to feel very optimistic about these things, even though there are clearly some things we would prefer not to be happening. What I am going to talk about tonight are two areas which are connected to what we've already heard, but fairly obviously are in my built environment category. So one of those is about movement management, the management of movement in cities and towns from a strategic viewpoint, and the other is about the design and the planning of transport in our towns and cities and how these might be changing, or we might hope they can change. Those who know me and know of me will know that all of our engineering actually is driven by an interest in behavior, actually, normal, what we call normal human behavior, which we all know very well means not normal at all, actually. It's certainly not standard. But it is something I want to, that we'll touch on several times here about this difference of levels of control and levels of allowing and enabling. Mid-20th century London street. If you look closely, you can see probably almost no control systems here. The only control systems here are actually inside the heads of the people sitting in those vehicles and walking around in those streets. It's this kind of system. Okay, it's completely a system that works by lots of different cells operating, sometimes interacting, sometimes not very integrated, but actually incredibly effective and efficient up to certain levels and in certain circumstances until you get your 11-day traffic jam. Late 20th century movement management has come along with technology development in a sense. So we start to discover artificial intelligence systems. The earliest ones we discover are actually really big and very expensive. So we try to think about having one big controller to take over. Now we don't need the brains anymore because we've got to have one big brain. So now we start to instruct these guys down at the bottom instead of asking them or informing them. And in a very real sense, that's what's been happening probably for the last 30 years or so at least in our management of movement in cities and towns. We've been trying to build better and better models to hold centrally a way of controlling, not necessarily in an evil way, I think, to try and do things better, but nevertheless, controlling. And this is how we do it. This is the one on the top corner there is the London Traffic Control Centre, and there's David Cameron, who of course does control all of London's traffic. The one on the right is the Berlin Control Centre, and being German, it doesn't require any human input whatsoever. This is the model, though, that we've been using for the management of our cities. And again, to a great extent, it has worked, but it's probably not the future. This is a tree, and this tree symbolizes the fact that many problems are directional in their solution. So all problems can be solved from different directions, but some problems are much easier to solve from one particular direction. And this is a kind of Edward de Bono example, where you take an ant and you put it on the trunk of the tree, and you, speaking in ant language, you ask it to go to a particular leaf, one particular leaf on the whole tree. It's an incredibly complex problem to solve. He might just get there first go. He may never get there, actually, if he's got no learning algorithm built into his system. Incredibly complex. However, take the ant and put it on a particular leaf and send it towards the tree trunk, and it will hit it pretty much every time, first time. So some problems need not just to be approached from a different direction, but they are very directional in their solutions. And we need to think about that, I think, when we're dealing with the management of movement. Here's Liverpool Street Station, not on a busy morning, actually. That's a fairly quiet morning on Liverpool Street, but really complex stuff going on there, incredibly complex movement, not soluble by somebody sitting in a control box telling each one of us where to go, but easily soluble by using those isolated mechanisms we have between our ears and informing us. So good information and good direction suddenly empowers us. So again, it's a system like this. But when you add information into it, and then you add in the potential not to be controlled from above, but to exchange ideas, the sorts of things Stephen's been talking about, the sorts of things Bill Ford was talking about, you suddenly start to have a much more empowered system, actually. And I think maybe I differ from Bill Ford in some of these things, because I think the power should be coming back into us to use these tools that we have in our pocket, in our car, and everywhere. It's not about being told, leave the freeway now. It's about being able to decide, I will sit in this traffic queue, or I will leave the freeway now, or I'll go another route. And I think it's all about us working to enable ourselves to make choices. Now, I think it will only be about that if we actually mobilize ourselves to say that's what we want to do with this. We don't want to be controlled by it. We want to be enabled by it. Second thing to talk about is transport planning. So again, I'm sorry, Bill, but this is my first car. It's an Austin A40. It's not actually my car because we didn't have colour photography then. But it is exactly the car I had, first of all. It's an Austin A40 designed by the great Pininfarina, arguably the first ever hatchback in the world. Anyway, that's not the subject of this talk. The point here is, if you're going to design an improvement to a system, and that's much of what we do when we're trying to deal with transport planning, is to look at what's going on at the moment and try to improve what's there. Design is a very, in a way, a very straightforward process, and there are critical steps in it. So here's my car. I want to design a better car than that, or I want to improve that car. I want it to run more efficiently, to use less fuel, to wear out less rubber, to be more adaptable for me. So I'm an engineer, and I look at those 5 or 6 things I've just said, and I improve them all. I got one of these. This is what happened when I did that. Now, actually, that's a good solution to something, but it's not a good solution to improving my car, because it's not a car, obviously. If you want to make a car better, you will gather around and say, what are we trying to make? A family car, and it can do this and that. And then we might split up, and you'll go and design the seats. And you'll make the seats a bit more comfortable. You'll make them safer on impact. I'll go away and I'll design something that slips through the air a bit more easily. We come back together, we put them back in the car. It turns out your seats are actually heavier than the old seats. So we can't do that. You've improved the seats, but you haven't improved the car. We can't have an improvement if it doesn't improve the whole thing. My body form slips through the air better, lower fuel. Handling is hopeless. We can't corner with the thing now. We can't have that either. It doesn't improve the whole car. Your job isn't to make a bit of the car better. East Croydon. Second time Croydon's been talked about tonight. East Croydon, one of the busiest stations in the whole of London, actually. Extraordinary busy place. It wanted to try and improve its transport connections, so it built itself a new station, a new tram stop, and a new bus station. Because somebody thought that integrated transport meant the transport should be integrated with itself, and that the way to do that was to build them all next to each other. So if you come out of East Croydon Station, about 4 meters in front of you is a tram stop, completely blocking your way, and to your left is a bus station, which you get to by crossing the tram tracks and a busy bus route. That was an improvement. Clearly it didn't improve East Croydon at all, because they're now making a new plan to try to unravel it. And importantly, it hasn't improved London either. So it's failed its design test. It should never have happened, and yet it has happened in our transport planning. Improvement. I remember reading a report of a legal case where somebody had an accident at some roadworks, some junction improvement works. And part of the way through the proceedings, one of the barristers had to turn to the judge and say, I should explain to Mlad that when highways engineers say the word improvement, they don't necessarily mean things get better. Now, it's true. It's true, this, and we all know it's true. And who would believe a sign that said, deliver an exciting vision for the town and local area by building a new road? I don't think it's going to happen. Manchester built itself a great new square at Piccadilly Gardens a few years ago. 2007, this image was taken. While it was doing it, it improved its bus station as well and its tram stop. This is the headline that was in the newspaper in 2007, a few weeks later. It improved Manchester by making it one of the top 10 worst places for pollution. That should never have happened. It couldn't pass the test of improving its place or its city, and yet in transport planning, it's being allowed to happen. But it can be better. This is what Liverpool did to the equivalent of their front of station a few years ago by ripping all of that stuff away. So there's optimism here. You can have this sort of thing in that world. But you can't have this. This is a ring road, which the guy who designed this, or the team who designed this, will quite rightly tell you improves the transport system. But you tell me how many people living here think that that's going to improve their place and their town. It doesn't, and therefore shouldn't be allowed to happen. Manchester, again, built itself a great new metro system, and it is a great system and it works very well and it's added greatly to the economy of the city, but it puts the stops in the middle of one of the potentially best squares in the city, where the cenotaph is in the city. You can't do that. That's not an improvement on the city. This is a park and ride. There can't be anything wrong with a park and ride. Surely park and rides are good things. You leave your car there, you get into a shuttle, you're saving fuel, you're reducing pollution at the centre of the city. But actually, does it make that place better that it's in? But you could have a park and ride that looked like this, that still accommodated the same number of cars, except now you can not only switch to a bike, an electric vehicle, or some other means, or a shuttle, but also it's a destination in itself. You could leave the car there to go out into the country, not just to go into the town. So instead of spending public money on making a piece of tarmac, which we know we can do, we could invest the same amount of money in making spaces like this, beautiful places on the edges of our city. That's an improvement. It improves the place, it improves the city, and it does all of those transport improvements that we care for. We should be able to make cities where you can do this more, walk around and cycle. This is Bogota on a Sunday morning, when every Sunday they close over 100 kilometres of city centre streets to vehicles. And this is what happens on a Sunday morning. Everybody just gets on anything that has wheels or not and hits the streets. And performances break out on the streets as well in this. And you would think, how can you do this in a city the scale of Bogota? And if we say this to transport planners and engineers in our cities, they look at us in horror, but all you have to do is do it. That's all you have to do. Just say, we're not having vehicles that day. It's really simple. Where they do have public transport, it doesn't land in the middle of one of their best squares. It lands on the edge of a space, and it's done in a very high quality way. So the people actually on the lowest incomes get the highest quality transport. If you go to Moscow and look at the buses there, they're really shockingly terrible. You have to be on the lowest income to want to go on, to need to go on them. That's not the case in somewhere like Bogota. Actually, the people on the lowest income are getting the most money invested in their transport. And we shouldn't also allow improvements which don't actually improve places for the different ways that we move around through our lives. We will, as people have heard me talk about this before, all of us will spend time moving in very different ways, and making a place better by continuing to exclude some of us from it is not an improvement. but we should allow this sort of thing to happen, and we know how to do all this sort of stuff. So, 3 messages really here. One is, I think, as Robert says, I'm a glass half full person, but I think that's because optimism and wrapped up with some realism is what will drive us on to make these changes. And it's where I'd agree with Bill Ford to some extent, that we can do this. We've got most of the technology that we need is there for us to make these big changes. I disagree with Bill in that I think what we should be doing is allowing. We should be using technology to allow us to get back to using this again, because this is an extraordinary tool that we have between our ears, and it is actually what we're about. So satisfying the needs of our own being is a good aim to have anyway. It's not very satisfactory to find something else that can do what you would like to do. And thirdly, to get us to remember that when we talk about integrating something, what we're trying to do is integrate it into the social, cultural, and economic vision and strategy of our city and town. We don't care whether a bus station integrates with a train station. If it damages our city, we don't want it to happen. What we want is the transport to integrate with what happens in that city. Thank you for listening.